All right, so we turn now to our first plenary address of the conference. And in a few moments, you will unavoidably notice that our first speaker is not Johnny Erickson Tada, and we're saddened that she's unable to join us. I am deeply, deeply grateful, however, to Reverend Eric Targe for agreeing to step in and bring an address to us on the topic of disability. Reverend Targe established the Moody Church's 139 Disability Ministry in 2014, and he serves as pastor for Disability Ministries and university students there at the Moody Church. He's also an adjunct professor of disability studies at Moody Bible Institute. And he's a graduate of both Moody Bible Institute and Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. I'm very grateful for his willingness to speak to us tonight out of his years of experience working with, ministering to, and serving individuals with disabilities and their families. Think about this now. God knew 2+ years ago when this conference was being planned that Eric was the one who's going to be speaking to us tonight. And I believe that he has an important word for us to hear in his talk, Christ's Disabled Body, how the risen and perforated Jesus speaks life to those with disabilities. Reverend Targe, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me at this conference. Good evening. It's truly an honor to have been asked to participate. When I looked at the speakers who would be presenting over the next couple of days and saw all of their PhDs and MDs and JDs, and then saw my name on the list, I couldn't help but hear Kermit the Frog singing that old song from Sesame Street in my ear. One of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong. I'm very excited to hear from the scholars that have been assembled for this conference, but I also want to acknowledge that I am primarily a pastor and not a scholar. Though I'm deeply grateful for my role as an adjunct professor at the Moody Bible Institute, my primary calling is 1 mile north at the Moody Church, where I have the blessing of co-laboring regularly with people of all abilities. My first joy is to open God's word to God's people so that they might see the beauty of God's kingdom and seek to follow our beautiful King Jesus. And so while it's my aim to thoughtfully engage the Academy tonight, the primary vantage point from which I'm going to be addressing a theology of disability and the body is pastoral and ecclesiological. So my hope in the next half hour that we have together is threefold. First, to briefly acknowledge the history of failure within the church toward those with disabilities. Then to see how the presence of the risen and perforated Christ exposes those failures. And lastly, to examine the way set forward by Christ to engage those with disabilities within and beyond the church. There's a common phrase in the disability community that says, nothing about us without us. And I truly want to honor that, while recognizing that my own history with disability is a bit convoluted. I have a close family member with multiple disabilities, but due to stigma, they have rejected the association with the disability community. Nevertheless, deafness and learning disabilities were very much part of my atmosphere growing up, though neurodiversity and deafness were viewed primarily in the medical model as deficiencies. I mean, even if it weren't stated bluntly, the mindset was that if someone was not healed, they couldn't be whole. It wasn't until actually I was in high school and became enamored with the deaf community in New York where I was living that I found that deafness was not considered at all to be a disability within deaf culture. Like my family member, they too disassociated from the disability community, rejecting the stigma and adopting the creed, deaf, not disabled. But why? Why has the stigma against physical and neurodiversity persisted, especially in a culture historically influenced by Judeo-Christian values. I think what we have to wrestle with is the question of, is the stigma of disability, seeing disability as brokenness and not wholeness, is that inherent to Christianity, or is it something that is infiltrated? Professor Thomas Reynolds, who authored the wonderful book Vulnerable Communion, would argue that perhaps it's because our culture has not been influenced by Christianity, as we assume, on the issue of disability, but rather that stigma has persisted because a different type of worship. That is the cult of normalcy, as he describes it. The cult of normalcy forces us to ask questions regarding wholeness and conformity. The cult possesses a standardizing power that maintains social control and determines what is acceptable. If you want to be part of the group, you'll look and act this way. And so the cult of normalcy transforms what is different into something that is not to be desired. This cult of normalcy, says Reynolds, is a symptom of an inwardly turned community that fears what is outside. I think this is seen time and time again in the church, as those experiencing mental health difficulties are seen as dangerous. Adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities are viewed as problematic, and those with physical disabilities are deemed an inconvenience. All of this serves to reveal the true object of many churches' worship: normalcy. Whether high church or low church, traditional or contemporary, young or old, it is the aim of many churches to appear to their target demographic to be normal. Their appeal to guests is that you can add Jesus and church to your life and need only to make slight modifications. You can have Jesus and church and still be normal, part of a normal community. For this reason, you'll find that even in churches that have significant populations that don't fit the quote unquote normal mold cast by their church, leadership and discipleship efforts will tend to focus primarily, if not exclusively, on those who fit the normal mold or possess the attributes of normal potential. Only then is that life deemed worthy of time and attention. Reynolds, reflecting on his son Chris, who has multiple disabilities, objects to this cult, saying that Chris's life is precious in its own right, determined not by the cult of normalcy, but rather by his life being created in the image of God, loved into being by God. Perhaps this is the death knell needed to the cult of normalcy within the church: a proper understanding of the image of God. Perhaps it's the church's historical misunderstanding of the image of God that has resulted in the exclusion, or we might even say, and I want to argue, the dismemberment of Christ's body. Now, please hear me. When I said that I was going to speak about Christ's disabled body, I did not mean to insinuate that Jesus Christ is disabled, as some disability liberation theologians have suggested. I don't see Jesus in a sip and puff chair as Nancy Iceland does. Rather, what I mean to say is that I believe we in the church are disabling the body of Christ by dismembering the church through our exclusion of those with disabilities. The Apostle Paul says in Romans 12, "For just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ, we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us." You see, such a statement by the Apostle Paul should have solidified Christian churches in all manifestations through time and space as the most neuro-diverse settings known to humankind. If we don't all have the same function, then differences should be embraced and celebrated. If we are all members of one body, then certainly every member has a role that needs to be learned and utilized in order to function as a healthy body. Notice again in Romans 12, I hope you're seeing that. The apostle says we have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us, not some of us, but each of us, which should tell us that the body of Christ certainly has no appendix, no gallbladder, no extra kidney, no part that can be easily removed without doing damage to the whole. And yet, in my former role before coming to the Moody Church, I served with Johnny Erickson Tata at Johnny and Friends Chicago. And the most common question from pastors and church leaders that I would receive about those with disabilities in their congregation was, can you help us find someplace else for them? My role at Johnny and Friends was to equip urban churches to better minister to those with disabilities among them. But my task was more often to help those who were rejected, that is, dismembered from their church family, to find a context in which they could be remembered into the body of Christ. Unfortunately, more often than not, the dismemberment did so much damage that a person or family was too hurt to try someplace new. Almost 1/3 of special needs families say that they had felt left out and they left one church because their child was not included or welcomed. Nearly 50% of special needs parents say that they refrain from participating in a religious activity because their child was not included or welcomed. Can you help us find someplace else for them? It broke my heart every time I heard this question. A middle-aged woman with schizophrenia, a family member who welcomed a son with Down syndrome, a daughter who was just diagnosed with autism. But I think what haunts me most is the deacon who had a stroke which affected his speech and ability to walk. He now used a wheelchair and was incredibly difficult to understand verbally and relate to. His children had gone to the church asking for assistance. And when church leadership got a hold of us, their question was not, can you help us better minister to this deacon, but can you help us find someplace else for him? You see, the cult of normalcy so quickly disposes of us the moment we no longer fit the mold. And according to most statistics, at some point, all of us will stop measuring up. According to the CDC, 1 in 4 US adults lives with a disability. And according to the UN, in countries that have life expectancies over 70 years, individuals spend on average about 8 years. That's 11.5% of their lifespan with disabilities. See, if the cult of normalcy within the church persists, our disposability and dismemberment from Christ's body is not so much about if, but when. It all comes back to the image of God. If the image of God is seen as primarily physical or rational, then those with disabilities are, as Martin Luther so tragically claimed, simply masses of flesh without a soul. Now, most pastors today would not dare speak in such offensive terms, but their lived reality and practices seem to often be in line with such thinking, as those with certain disabilities are discarded as unworthy of shepherding time and resources. Martin Luther's recommendation of euthanizing the 12-year-old boy, who many now believe had Prader-Willi syndrome, may have been mostly forgotten by history. But his posture has persisted to influence society for generations. At the turn of the 19th century, with institutionalized care and costs on the rise, Principles that were applied to livestock started to be applied to people. As breeders were able to come up with stronger stock through selective breeding, they began to ask, how could this be applied to humans? And so in 1911, a committee of scientists, lawyers, and scholars were assembled by the American Breeders Association to address the issue of intellectual disability. Their recommendation: sterilization must, in the opinion of this committee, be the principal agent used by society in cutting off the supply of the defectives. By 1926, 23 states in the United States had laws permitting the sterilization of people with disabilities. In 1927, sterilization was upheld in the Supreme Court by Oliver Wendell Holmes, saying, "Better to sterilize than to wait for degenerate offspring to commit crimes. 3 generations of imbeciles is enough," he said. All this in a so-called Judeo-Christian nation, but in reality, a nation steeped in the cult of normalcy. Again, we would never vocalize this idea of defective within our church walls, but this concept of defective is seen in our churches as we build prototypes of what a good Christian in our church context is. I mean, every church has this prototype, whether stated or assumed, regarding what a mature disciple looks like. And too often it's to the exclusion of those with intellectual and developmental disabilities, resulting in the stunting of their spiritual growth. As I've shared, a deacon can fit the prototype one Sunday, discipling and duplicating, building the church, and then due to a stroke become undisciplable and disposable the next week, the moment they no longer fit the prototype. Sarah grew up in a church with an assumed prototype that she didn't fit. I'm changing her name for the sake of privacy. Growing up, her sister remembers hearing Sarah praying that Jesus would heal her of Down syndrome, that she would be made, again, normal. She knew that she wasn't cursed. She knew that her Down syndrome was not because of sin. Nevertheless, she deeply felt cursed and broken, similar to how the apostles asked Jesus in John 9, who sinned that this man was born blind? Sarah internalized the message of our cultural apostles that asked, who sinned that this person was born? Was her existence a mistake? Was she simply a defective to be discarded? This was her fear until she moved to Chicago with her sister and saw the new possibilities in the risen Christ. You see, in John 20, we're met by a Jesus who disrupts cultural narratives and assumptions. For first century Jews, his resurrection challenged their concepts of the coming kingdom. For Greeks, his resurrection challenged their understanding of the value of the body. For us, the body of the risen and perforated Jesus should challenge our concepts of wholeness and healing, and our values of consumerism and radical autonomy. But first, let's focus on that disruption of our wholeness and healing narratives in the life of Sarah. As I mentioned, before Sarah moved to Chicago, it was a regular prayer of hers that she be healed of Down syndrome. She grew up in a Christian family, regularly attending church and reading scripture. The risen Jesus to her was meant to point her toward a day when she could shed her broken body and be recreated into a new, whole, and limitless being. The risen Jesus for Sarah, though, spoke only of discontinuity with her current life, which made God and eternity seem distant and unhelpful. It made church a constant reminder of her brokenness and need to be fixed. When Sarah moved with her sister to Chicago, church was the low point of her week. She would sleep in and delay the family, was disruptive during the service, and was generally regarded as unhappy and unpleasant. But when the disability ministry at the Moody Church was started about a year after Sarah's arrival, things began to change. When looking at the resurrected Jesus in John 20, Sarah saw something that she had missed in her 40 plus years of life in the church thus far. Jesus still had scars, holes in his hands and feet. He said to Thomas, "Put your fingers here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side." You see, for Thomas, this told him that Jesus, the Jesus who suffered and died, was alive again. For Sarah, it meant that the Jesus who suffered and died and was alive again was whole, even if he had holes. The markings of his suffering were not discarded as meaningless when he was resurrected. Rather, the lamb who was slain would stand in heaven looking like a lamb that had been slain. What did this mean? How could Jesus enter into eternity with a less than normal body? Would the resurrected Sarah be in any way recognizable as Sarah who had Down syndrome, she wondered? Would she still be short and stocky? Would her eyes still be almond-shaped? Would she, in fact, still be Sarah, but glorified? Up until this point, Sarah believed that resurrection was closer to reincarnation than glorification. She believed that her new body would be a different body, completely disassociated with her experiences of joy and suffering in this body due to its perceived deficiencies. She saw eternity as detached from who she was now. Listen, Sarah recognized that for those who fit the standard of normal, that they also would be transformed, as she knew that Jesus's disciples didn't fully recognize who he was at first because of his glorified state. But up until this point, she had believed that her transformation would need to be so much greater than everyone else's. When Sarah was able to see Jesus as wounded and yet whole, ascending into heaven bodily, heaven and discipleship became all the more beautiful. You see, now her story mattered. Her experiences mattered. Her life here on earth in her body mattered because her body marked with disability mattered. For this reason, when we teach about Jesus's ascension in our Sunday school for those with intellectual disabilities, we say that Jesus ascended holy, holy, holy. Our point is simple. Jesus is a whole person, and his sainthood, his beauty, his holiness is in no way tarnished by his having holes. You see, our stories, our experiences, our joys and suffering are what make us us. For this reason, many who use wheelchairs or are blind or deaf, when asked if they would want to be healed in heaven, are actually unsure. The idea of separating us from our story naturally produces a dissociative state. People, they wonder, what is continuity? But Jesus doesn't do that. He does not erase our story. He restores our story. The risen Jesus is perforated and yet in no way inhibited. To Sarah and to many with various disabilities, this message of resurrection is incredibly life-giving. No longer are they told that the old Sarah must die so that a new person devoid of her experiences can be born in her place. But rather, when the old Sarah dies, it is that same Sarah who is raised to a new and glorified life. Her life matters. Her experience matters. And so her discipleship matters. In fact, I believe the implications of the risen and perforated Christ on discipleship are for people of all abilities. And perhaps the lens of disability is the lens we need to view discipleship through in order to see the great deficiencies in our typical discipleship practices. You see, discipleship in most American churches today seems to be heavily focused on discipleship of the intellect. Now, I'm not suggesting that we avoid intellect. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. In fact, I believe Jesus puts great emphasis on the intellect when he says in part that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord with all our mind. However, in many churches, I think we've put the emphasis on the mind to the exclusion of the command to love the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul. It's assumed that if they love the Lord with all their mind, that the heart and soul will just fall into place. Perhaps this was the mindset of the Pharisees and religious rulers who invited Jesus to their Sabbath festivities in Luke 14. They enjoyed gathering in their intellectual enclaves and honoring one another with invitations to each other's homes and seats of honors. But Jesus challenged their assumptions of what a worthy disciple looked like. He challenged their visions of who would sit in the places of honor at the heavenly king's table. In Luke 14:12, Jesus surveys his fellow invitees and then publicly turns to his host, not to compliment him on assembling an esteemed band of brothers, but to rebuke him for inviting all the wrong people. Jesus says to his host, when you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Now, what is Jesus saying here? Is he saying that those with disabilities have nothing to offer? I don't think that's it. He's not saying that the categories of people he mentioned have nothing to give, but rather that this kind of people that he is describing do not give reciprocally. You see, in a consumeristic society, we are obsessed with reciprocity. Hence, we established as etiquette at our wedding banquets, the cover your plate rule, a common practice as I was growing up in New York of choosing a wedding gift with a similar price tag as the cost per plate at the reception. Thomas Reynolds is once again helpful here in his coining of the term body capital in regard to how culture establishes the value of a body and its abilities based on the community's sense of the good, how it gains legitimacy, purchases recognition, or acquires worth in the context of others. Our radical expectation of reciprocity, which permeates much of society, often looks at those with disabilities and sees no capital to offer. Rather, society sees dependence and vulnerability. And they see dependence and vulnerability as negative attributes to be avoided, threats to freedom and flourishing. Jean Vanier, the founder of L'Arche, a network of communities for people with intellectual disabilities, saw this very differently, arguing that freedom is only possible in the context of dependence and vulnerability. Vanier says that we do not discover who we are. We do not reach true humanness in a solitary state. We discover it through mutual dependency in weakness, in learning through belonging. This was the lesson that Henry Nouwen, the theologian and Catholic priest, learned from a man named Adam during his time at L'Arche. Adam could not speak or even move without assistance. And yet Nouwen says of Adam that he was his friend, his teacher, and his guide. Nouwen dressed Adam and fed Adam, and he did not receive dressing and feeding in return. There was no reciprocity, but Nouwen certainly was ministered to by Adam. he received from Adam. As now when a writer and professor became confronted with his own vulnerability and illness and had everything stripped away from him, he learned from Adam what it means to believe in his belovedness, even when he had nothing to be proud of. Now one writes, I was becoming like Adam. He had nothing to be proud of. Neither had I. He was completely empty. So was I. He needed full-time attention. So did I. I found myself resisting this becoming like Adam. I did not want to be dependent and weak. I did not want to be so needy. Somewhere, though, I recognized that Adam's way, the way of radical vulnerability, was also the way of Jesus. See, this community of weakness and belonging is what Christ invites his host to experience in Luke 14. If his host wants a foretaste of the glorious kingdom banquet of heaven, then he will invite those who are most vulnerable and dependent to be honored at his table: the deaf, the lame, the blind, the sojourner. About 4 years ago, I met Maria and her family for the first time. Maria, her husband, and their 2 adult sons had attended a variety of churches over the years. Both of her sons have autism and are nonverbal communicators. Both regularly experience sensory overstimulation, which causes them to jump, scream, and occasionally to act out violently. After being asked to leave multiple churches for 2 decades because of issues with her sons, she had given up on finding a church and was simply attending online services for about 8 years, until someone told her about how the Moody church was hosting a dinner for families affected by intellectual and developmental disabilities. At the time, we called these our family fun nights. Now we call them our 139 friends nights. But really, what they were was Luke 14 banquets. Maria and her family had trouble that night and almost didn't attend because of how delayed they were by their sons. When they finally got into the front door of the church, Maria's oldest son, Tyler, started screaming and jumping so violently that she told her husband that they should just leave. Thankfully, one of our 139 buddies got their attention before they could. The volunteer asked him, said, "Hey, where are you going?" And Maria responded saying, we'll come back another time when my sons are more calm. She kept saying, "I don't want my family to be a burden." But the volunteer pleaded with Maria to just look inside the room we were meeting in. And I love the way that Maria described it. I've written it down. She saw arms flapping the way her sons with autism's arms flapped. She heard the screams of those with Tourette's. She saw people of all ages being fed and feeding others. She heard and saw beeping chairs and oxygen machines. She says, it was as though she looked into the gates of heaven and saw and heard that there was a place there for her family. This is what Christ invites us to see the banquet of heaven as more than our personal conceptions of paradise, to allow the beauty of the kingdom to eclipse the pleasantness of the beach cabana, to see heaven as an intricate ecosystem rather than a simple resort or spa. If Christ compares the kingdom of heaven to a table filled with the vulnerable and dependent, then perhaps the glimpses we give of heaven to the outside world as they look at our churches and at our dinner tables, perhaps that is what is truly defective. You may be a doctor, a nurse, a lawyer, or even a pastor watching this. It's possible and maybe likely that you're an elder or leader in your church. My hope from this talk tonight, my hope that you remember is that the rebuke of Christ was not to the synagogue. All too often, I think we're confronted, when we're confronted by failures within the church, we make them failures of our programmatics. Well, then we should hire a disability pastor, assign disability to a staff member or a volunteer, create a program. But Jesus doesn't propose any special titles or roles, programs or ministries. His suggestion is simple: that you host a dinner and invite those that society deems vulnerable and dependent. Search for a local group home in your neighborhood and take a client or two for coffee and a donut. Invite a family affected by disability within your church over for dinner. Sit with those whose speech is hard to understand. Put your hand over theirs to help them eat. Receive from them the gifts they offer. Allow them to minister to you. Recognize your own vulnerability and dependence, and see in theirs a benefit and not a hindrance. These actions and this disposition truly reflects the kingdom of our holy, holy, holy Jesus. Thank you for joining me this evening.
Thank you, Reverend Targe. That was moving, beautiful, convicting, just tremendous. Thank you so much for sharing out of your experience and your ministry. I would like, if you have a minute or two, we could take a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Of course.
One of my areas of interest. So for those of you who have questions, put those in the Q&A. I will maybe prime the pump a little bit here. One of my areas of interest is the intersection of theology, bioethics, and culture. And so I'm sure you're aware of the film Sound of Metal, which was up for an Oscar this year. In fact, the lead actor won an Oscar. And it very much raises exactly that question that you mentioned about deafness and whether that's something to be corrected or healed, or if it's simply a different way of existing, of living. But I just watched a film over the weekend called The Writer, which is not a very well-known film, although it was directed by Chloe Zhao, who won the Oscar for Best Picture this year for Nomadland. And there are no actors in the film. That's kind of one of the interesting things about it. It's all what we would think of as cowboys. They're bull riders. And the film doesn't really center on disability per se. It features some on injury. But one of the characters in the film is a bull rider who has been, extremely seriously injured and is quadriplegic, and has also lost the ability really to speak and to communicate. And there's several of these just really beautiful moments in the film where the main character, has had a head injury and may not be able to compete again in rodeo, goes to visit his friend, and he's learned sign language to be able to communicate with this friend. And he just walks in and he hugs him, and he just treats him the same way he always would have treated him. And it's just really a beautiful picture of one man caring for another man, and treating him as a friend and as an equal, without kind of any regard at all for his appearance, his limitations. He has a rag and he keeps his face white, things like that.
Yeah.
It's just a really interesting picture. Are there other cultural artifacts like that, films or television shows that you might recommend that give a good portrayal of what it looks like to love someone with disability well?
Oh, that's a phenomenal question. That is a phenomenal question. So part of my class that I teach at the Moody Bible Institute is called Disabilities, Society, and the Church. And as part of that class, one of the assignments that I have students do is they have to watch a film that portrays disability and write a report on whether or not it was accurately portrayed based on different studies. And I have people watch quite a few ones that do an awful job. I deeply appreciate some of them, some are Oscar winners. Rain Man has many wonderful things about it, but that too many people watch it and thinks that's what autism is. And there's a famous phrase in the autism community: if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And so that is not what autism is. It's perhaps one place of that, but a great film. Though I can't call it a Christian film. I can't call any good disability films that I know of, at least Christian films. Perhaps someone can include one in the Q&A or the chat. But Peanut Butter Falcon came out a little while ago, and that was a phenomenal film that really displayed that showed the someone who truly loved and appreciated someone with intellectual and developmental disabilities well, and embraced that person. It's a really interesting, a very interesting movie. There are quite a few movies. I think Wonder does a phenomenal job of speaking about facial differences. It's a huge thing in the disability community that we don't often address, the idea of facial difference. A movie that's quite sad but helpful to understand the inner thinkings of those who are struggling with quadriplegia is a movie called Mar Adentro. It was an Oscar winner years back. It translates The Sea Inside. I think it won Oscar for Best Foreign Film quite a few years ago. But one of the things I love about that film is the interaction that the main character, who had suffered an accident and was now quadriplegic, the conversation he has with the priest, where the priest is asking him, says, what kind of freedom is death? And he argues this, what kind of freedom is this? And so just the interplay there is actually, the conversation is very interesting. I could actually give a long list of movies, but I also do see there's questions there. So
good. Yeah, we have one question. Your ministry sounds amazing. Do you train other church personnel?
So my former role was to do that. So in my former role with Johnny and Friends Chicago, I would work with a variety of churches, training and helping them to grow in their understanding of how to better minister to those with disabilities. And I know that I shared that I often heard, is there any place else that you can send them? But there were some churches in Chicago that I was very grateful that were open and desiring to truly connect and grow in their care for those with disabilities. If you're interested in starting a disability, there are many places I would point you to. Obviously, Johnny and Friends would be a major one. They have places all around the world that are seeking to better equip pastors. Another place you might want to consider is called Key Ministry. Key Ministry has currently many Zoom calls. They also do web conferences and different types of things. So they had John Swinton a little while back, Dr. John Swinton, who is an amazing scholar who I'm deeply indebted to for so much of my understanding of ministering to those with mental health diagnoses. And so there are quite a few ministries out there like that, Key Ministry, Johnny and Friends, that can do that. And I'm always glad to speak with someone.
Great, thanks. We have other questions, but our time is kind of at hand here. So I hate to kind of leave those to the side, but is there a way, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I kind of am. Is there a way that people could get directly in touch with you? Would that be okay through the Moody, perhaps?
Yeah, that'd be phenomenal. If you go to, I'll give two ones and you can choose which one to take. On the bottom of this screen, you likely see the spelling of my name. It's eric.targe@moodychurch.org. Doesn't get much more simple than that. eric.targe@moodychurch.org, or you could go to moodychurch.org/139. That is our Disability Ministries webpage. At the bottom of the page, there's a contact us, and I'd be glad to get in touch with you.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been a tremendous blessing. And I'm so glad that you were able to join us tonight. So just like previously, we will end this webinar, and then we will start right back up in the next one. Thank you again, Reverend Targe.
Thank you.